What is up, night crawlers? Thank you so much for being here and welcome back to the Nightmare's Edge. I know it's been a while since I've uploaded, but sadly things have taken much longer than expected, so thank you very much for sticking with me. That being said, tonight I bring to you an original and currently an exclusive. This is a story I wrote myself, so please don't judge too harshly. Once again, thank you so much for being here. It is truly appreciated. Now, without any further ado, please sit back, relax, and let me tickle those inner fears. When I was about 13 years old, my father and grandfather had finally taken me fishing on the family fishing trip, somewhere off the coast of Western Canada. I remember my grandpa spending a lot of time talking about just the right spot, which turned out to be absolutely beautiful. As it turns out, this had been a very special spot for Grandpa for so long. Since it was mid-March, I think the temperature was around 40 degrees that first day. It was still too cold out to go without proper warm wear, so my dad made sure we were all bundled up pretty well, including my grandpa. After making a huge fuss about taking care of himself, Grandpa told us we needed to grab the tackle from the truck and head down to the water's edge. I remember when we were pulling the tackle out of the camper, there had been a box that I noticed had some dark red round sticks in them, about as long as my forearm. I remember asking my dad what they were, and he glanced at them. 13-year-old me didn't notice the look of surprise in his eyes, but he had said they were road flares and we didn't need them. I accepted that and no longer gave it any further thought and never saw them again. When we got to the fishing spot, my father immediately started gathering supplies to start a fire. My grandfather and I started getting our fishing rig set up for a slow night of fishing and drinking. I was 13 years old, but my father and grandfather had allowed me a few sips at different holidays. And to this day, I remember it being so disgusting every time. But I acted like it tasted great, just like they did. This fishing trip had been a tradition for my family since long before I was born. My grandmother had always gone with Grandpa and Dad. Even my mom had gone a few times, but she mostly just stayed home with us kids, while the other three would go on the trip. Even though I desperately wanted to go, I had not been allowed to go until I was 13 years old. Sadly, my grandmother had passed away a couple years before that, which left only Dad and Grandpa to go on these trips, and at first, that didn't go very well. I remember the first couple of years after Grandma died were very hard for my grandfather. He had adamantly refused to go on their yearly fishing trip. I can still hear my mom and dad spending countless hours trying to convince my grandfather that Grandma would not like him sitting at home missing her. It had taken a long time to think this over, but he still refused. My father had said something to Grandpa that struck me as odd, but I never asked about it. He had said that we had important work that needs to be done. No matter how much I thought about it, this never made sense to me and confused me for years. Even still, Grandpa refused. And that is when my mom finally came up with the idea that only the men of the family would go on the fishing trip. I could barely contain my excitement because that would finally include me. I begged and begged and begged Grandpa to go, and finally, he caved. On the drive up, Grandpa told me the spot was chosen because it was where he had proposed to Grandma. He said he had proposed after they had taken a long excursion into the wilderness, and then they camped just a few hundred yards away from the water. Since they had been engaged, they had come back to this same spot every year until Grandma had been struck ill with cancer. Even until she died, Grandma had insisted they continue to come on the fishing trip. Finally, it was time to get our lines in the water. I was so freaking excited. We cast our lines out, set the drag, and stood there for a long time, waiting, expecting. Eventually, each of us settled in our seats waiting for their first bite, which Dad said to this point still had not come in the many years they had been fishing here. I looked over at them. Dad and Grandpa sat there staring out at their lines and into the water, almost like they thought they were going to be able to see the bite coming. Dad had said that it was because it was his first time back since Grandma passed, but as the night grew on, Grandfather started drinking very heavily. While I knew this was out of character for him, Dad had said not to pay him any mind and to let him be. He would be back to normal Grandpa in the morning. So I just tried to stay out of his way as Dad suggested. I pulled out my Game Boy Advance and started playing some game. I don't even remember what game. As it turns out, Grandpa had different plans. After a few minutes and the only sound was the bleeps and bloops from my Game Boy, he got up and looked at me. He smiled and asked if I wanted to hear some stories. Not just any stories though, but stories of the strange and impossible. I shook my head in a hurried agreement as the excitement took over my senses. At the time, I figured he knew I loved those kinds of stories. At that age, my favorite movie ever was The Monster Squad. I had watched it probably 1,000 times in my short life. Then he began telling me stories of Bigfoot and werewolves and vampires and fairies, and the list went on. He was having so much fun recounting the stories he had heard over the years. But one of the stories had been particularly interesting. I remember he had become more somber as he started to tell the story. And this was a long time ago, so I don't recall the exact way he told it. But the quick of it, fishermen and sailors told stories of these creatures that would emerge from the watery depths every few years. Their only goal? To kill humans. They would often lure these people in by playing with the fishing lines to get the unsuspecting to investigate. That is when they would be pulled underwater and slaughtered or drowned. According to Grandpa, this apparently happened just before a major snowstorm. And this wasn't just in Canada, but all over the world. He even told a story of a town on the Amazon River. Yup, the Amazon River. There had been an actual snowstorm, and according to Grandpa, these sea people wiped out the entire town during that storm. At least, this is what he told us, because apparently no one ever made it back alive to tell the tale. And that's what it was, a tale. But Grandfather enjoyed telling it, so my dad and I just sat listening. My interest boiling over listening to the story, while Dad kept an eye on our poles. Before he continued with another story, Grandpa paused to grab another beer, and in that moment, we all heard the familiar sound of line being taken from the reel. We were all shocked. In all of these years, never had there been an actual bite, and while they always half-heartedly tried to catch fish, I was led to expect it was unlikely to happen, so this was truly a shock. My grandfather dropped his freshly opened beer, ran to his pole and grabbed it. He yanked hard to try to set the hook, but the line snapped instantly. My father started laughing at the situation, and even before he could get his second howl of laughter out, another bite. "What the hell?" my dad said in excitement. He ran for his rod and started to crank the reel, but gave it a couple moments before he tried to set the hook. When he did, his deep sea rod almost doubled over on itself. He fought for a few minutes, and then, a sound like a .22 rifle going off, the rod snapped, echoing through the nearby woods. He fell flat on his ass, and my grandpa burst into laughter. Before we could fully appreciate the hilarity of the situation, my reel started singing. I grabbed it immediately and started reeling in line. I struggled hard against the weight of whatever was on the other end, and when I whipped the pole back to set the hook, I felt it sink in. I fought with this beast for at least 20 minutes before my grandfather said, "Give me the pole." I reluctantly handed it over, and he began a frenzy of reeling and yanking back on the pole. And suddenly, it stopped. The weight of this fight had taken Grandfather all the way to the shore, so I thought it had been a good thing that he didn't try to go into the water to keep fighting the fish. Then, after a moment of pause, he tried to readjust his position when a sudden yank on the pole pulled him forward and off balance. He fell into the water. My dad and I started laughing, but after a few seconds, we realized there was no more movement, no struggle to stand up, and no air bubbles. My father and I then became extremely concerned. It was as if as soon as he went under the water, he disappeared. My dad and I charged into the water where Grandpa had gone under and began dragging our hands beneath the surface, hoping to catch hold of any part of my grandfather. But after searching until our bodies were numb, my father finally pulled me out of the water. "Call the cops," he said firmly. But I started to protest. "I said call the fucking cops," he yelled at me. The anger in his voice was enough to stop any further argument. My father had never yelled at me before. Too much was happening for my tiny mind to keep up. I stood there like a deer caught in headlights, so my dad snatched my phone from my hand and dialed 911. That was 9 years ago. My grandfather's body was never recovered, and we were never able to identify what pulled him in. We mourn him till this day. We had stopped going to that spot for a few years, but eventually, to show our respects, we started returning as a family. Not just the men, but everyone. On one of our trips, I met a beautiful local girl named Kay, who ended up spending some time with us for the first year we returned. She talked about all the great spots to visit and all the spots to avoid. She'd given us her number and said, "Call if you need anything," and looked at me. There was an awkward pause and I said, "Thank you," and we left. Are we not going to talk about how you just blew that cutie off when she was clearly flirting with you?" My mom said to me teasingly. "What are you even talking about? You're too old to understand how we young people flirt, and that," as I looked over my shoulder, "that was not flirting," I said, only half joking, not noticing that my mom had already started dialing on the phone. "Hi, Kay. Yes, I was wondering if you could show us the way." A pause. "That's right, it's been a few years since we've been here, and we would like to make sure we make it there." Another pause. "Great, thank you so much. We'll see you in an hour or so." She hung up the phone and smiled at me. And that is how I met the love of my life. It seems my mom did know what she was talking about after all. We've been married for 3 years now. We love the outdoors and spend a lot of time there, hiking, backpacking, sailing. You get the point. One of our favorite activities is scuba diving. After many long talks about this year's trip to our grandparents' spot, it was decided that we would dive just off the coast so we could see what it was like under there. It was going to be hard, but I felt like if I saw it with my own eyes, I might understand why they were never able to find my grandfather's body. The whole family showed up for this trip. It was my dad, mom, 2 little sisters, their boyfriend and husband, my uncle and his wife, Kay, and myself. It was a large party, so there was a lot of supplies that needed to be lugged back to our camp. Winter was just setting in, and there had been just a small snowfall on the trip up. My parents had been here in worse weather, so we were not bothered. We spent the morning hiking back and forth from the vehicles to the campsite, bringing our supplies. The snow had begun to fall a bit heavier. Still, none of us became too concerned. By the time we got everything to the campsite, the snow had stopped and we were optimistic that it would not continue until after we packed up and left. So we unpacked and started settling in for the stay. That night, while waiting to go to bed, we were gathered around the campfire. I sat on the opposite side of the water as I found the view to be very relaxing. We sat there for a couple hours just talking about Grandma and Grandpa, remembering some of the crazy stories they would tell, and just enjoying the evening, when something down in the water caught my attention. It was only visible for a brief moment, but it looked like a fin followed by a tail. And from this distance, I could tell that this thing was probably as long as I was tall, about 6 feet. I stood up hoping to get a better view, but whatever it was gone. I told everyone about it, and we all watched the water for a while, but no one saw anything. They made fun of me for seeing things, but eventually we decided to call it a night. The following morning, we got up and the temperature was fairly warm for that time of day, about 45 degrees. We had been practicing for a dive like this for a while, so we were already acclimated for the cold water. As we were getting our wetsuits on and gear ready, My uncle came over to tell us the news that a massive storm was coming in later that evening, so we should not spend much time in the water. Kay and I decided that we were still going to attempt our dive. After getting ready, my father took us out a short distance in a little boat, and then we dropped into the water about 50 feet off the shoreline. It was only around 11 a.m., but it appeared that you could see clear to the bottom from the surface. We knew that when you got down there though, it was going to be dark, so we brought our flashlights just in case we needed them. We slowly sank to the bottom, and even though the water was very clear, we had to turn our lights on about halfway down. Once we reached the bottom, I began to feel very uncomfortable. It wasn't something that I was familiar with, and every once in a while, I could swear I saw a large shadow that seemed out of place. I started looking around, and even with the research I'd done over the years, I could not understand how they had not been able to locate my grandfather's body. I was just only beginning to think this through when again I saw that shadow. Only this time it zipped past me, directly towards my wife, and with impossible speed. I saw my wife's light begin moving through the water, away from me. Stunned for a moment, I watched helplessly as she was pulled further and further away. Finally, I snapped back to my senses. I started desperately chasing the light, as it was now the only thing that I could see in front of me. I didn't notice that it seemed to have slowed a bit, like just enough to keep the light in view. I swam frantically for a few minutes when I noticed the light had come to a stop. I continued another 20 yards or so, and my heart sank as I saw the light resting on the ocean floor. I started to panic and was about to surface when I saw what looked like a cave entrance. With the singular thought of my wife, I swam inside. Only about 15 feet into the cave, I was able to make out a small ledge above me. I swam towards it, and as I was about to reach the ledge, my head unexpectedly emerged from the water. This cave had air inside. It made no sense to me. Before I could think any further, I felt a sharp pain in my leg. It didn't feel like a bite, just one quick stabbing pain, and then whatever had pierced my leg was yanked away. I yelped in surprise and pulled myself up onto the ledge. The blood was pouring from the piercing wound in my leg and pulling on the rock around me. I quickly backed away from the edge to put some distance between myself and the water in case whatever it was returned. Then, after a few moments, I used my flashlight to look around the small chamber. The ledge was only about 5 feet deep and didn't appear to lead anywhere else. All at once, I remembered that something had taken my wife. I wanted to get back into the water to search for her, but I was terrified. I had no idea what had stabbed my leg, and with nothing around to stop the bleeding, I had no idea how to treat my wound. As full panic mode started to set in, and I felt my sanity start to slip, something flew from the water and landed on the shelf a few feet in front of me. I leaped back in fear, hitting my head on the rock wall, and instantly, I felt the blood start to trickle down the back of my skull. As I raised my hand to the wound, I shone my light onto the mass that had come up out of the water. It laid there, motionless before me. Then I realized, that's my wife. Crying out, I raced forward, pulling her away from the ledge. She was bleeding from everywhere, from so many cut marks on her wetsuit that I could not possibly count them all. She wasn't responding to me, and her eyes were closed. I ripped both of our masks off. Baby, please God, don't let her die. I smacked her face twice in desperation, and she finally stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and she winced as the pain flooded her senses. After a moment, she laid back down, holding her hand over her chest. I could see blood flowing, but I didn't understand that it was coming from a small puncture wound around her heart. She finally made eye contact with me. She was about to say something when I heard something breach the surface of the water. I looked up and shined my light towards the sound. My mind could not fathom what I was looking at. There in front of me was a head, but not a human head. It had what appeared to be a fin protruding from the crest. Its eyes shone back at me as I held the light on its face. Suddenly, I became aware that there were 3 more heads, just like the first. That is when I recalled my grandfather and his stories of those fishermen and sailors and the creatures they encountered. What did he call them? The name wasn't coming to me, What the fuck did he call them? I said aloud in frustration. Then, like a shock, it hit me. Water nymph. My wife placed her hand on my cheek, pulling me from my thoughts, and I looked down at her, momentarily forgetting those heads were floating just a few feet away in the water. I'm sorry. I didn't expect to fall in love with you. What do you mean, baby? Her eyes closed and her body went limp. No. I cried as I began clumsily beating on her chest, trying to bring her back, but it didn't work. I screamed as another sharp pain exploded in my shoulder. I looked down to see a stick or something embedded in my right shoulder. What the fuck? I asked quietly in disbelief, again not understanding what was happening, and another sharp pain in my left shoulder. I didn't bother looking down because I knew it was going to be the same thing. I looked out at the heads just above the surface of the water. I could see that they were waiting for me to die. My vision began to blur, and I was sure that this was the place I was going to die. So I looked down at my wife. The horror of what I saw pulled me back from the brink. There, in her wetsuit, laying on my lap was one of those things. Her face was now hideous, scaly like a fish, lips drawn back to reveal rows of jagged fang-like teeth. My mind reeled, reaching its limits, not knowing if what I saw was real or some kind of hallucination. At that moment, the shock now fully set in. I pushed the creature off me and stood up. In my haze, I thought I heard booms coming from outside the cave and noticed that the other heads had disappeared, but it didn't matter. I assumed they were still there, waiting to finish what they had started. Numb, I dove into the water without my mask. Though I was certain I wouldn't make it, I began kicking as hard as I could, desperate to escape. I felt a sharp pain in my foot, and this time I felt a tug, like they were trying to fish me back. I fought against the pull, but as my breath started to disappear and my adrenaline faded, I no longer had the will to keep fighting, and for the second time, I was prepared to die. So I stopped struggling. I woke to find myself in a hospital bed, my parents on each side. I stared at them for a long moment, not understanding, not knowing if I had just awoken from a nightmare or a drug-induced hallucination or whatever. I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry. The events now starting to flood my mind like a terrible nightmare from which I still had not awoken. A nightmare in which my wife, Kay, had been murdered. She was murdered by sea people. Her people. I just laid my head back and tears started rolling down my face. What a weird-ass dream, I thought at first, but then realized I was sobbing harder the more that it came back to me. If it was a dream, why am I still crying? I wondered. I opened my eyes and both my mom and dad were both watching me with tears streaming down their own faces. Kay? I asked. Oh, honey, my mom said as she stood up and leaned over me, wrapping me in her arms and pulling me in as close as possible in an awkward hug. I'm so sorry, she said. Sorry? I asked, the word echoing in my head. I looked at my dad sitting in his chair, the look of a man who didn't know what to say on his face. Can you tell us what happened? He finally asked. You need to get your story right before the cops come back. What do you mean? I asked. Son, tell me what happened. He said a bit more forcefully, and his face settled into more of a stern look. My mom finally picked herself up off me and sat back down in her chair, wiping her eyes clear of the remaining tears, and her posture straightened, turning to a more serious note. A bit of concern slipped from her eyes and the corner of her mouth. I told my parents about the horrors of what I saw down there. I told them about how I followed them into that god-awful cave, how they had tossed Kay up on the rock in front of me, beaten and bloodied, that she died in my arms. I looked at their faces and couldn't tell if they believed me or not. I paused for a moment to collect my thoughts, and before I could speak again, my dad asked, Where's her body, son? At that instant, a question screamed out in my mind. Do they think I killed her? I looked at my mom. I didn't do it. You know I could never. My mom shook her head. Shh. We know you didn't do it, honey. Her voice was soft but cold, something I had never heard in her voice before. I looked at my dad. He sat there staring at me for a few moments, not saying anything. And then I saw his shoulders slump just slightly, like he had been trying to hold something back, but realizing that there was no other option than to say what was on his mind, no matter how difficult it might be. I could see it in his eyes, and I could see it in my mom's eyes as well. They knew I was telling the truth. "Son," my dad said slowly, "there's something we need to talk about. It isn't going to be easy to hear, but you need to know." I looked over at my mom, and she sat there looking at me, with eyes waiting for my reaction. "Do you remember when you were younger, your grandfather told us those stories on the first fishing trip?" he asked. "You mean the monster stories? Bigfoot and werewolves? Those dumb stories?" I asked, almost thinking he was about to tell me some big joke. "Yes, but son, one of those stories he told wasn't just some dumb story." He looked hard at me. "In fact, you just experienced one of those dumb stories firsthand." I looked at him confused, and the image of those damn heads on the surface of the water down in the cave came to mind. Those fins, the scales on Kay's face after she died. "Are you saying that those were water nymphs?" I demanded. "Some would call them mermaids or mermen, but yes, that's exactly what those things are." "So you're saying Kay was a..." My voice trailed off. "Kay was a what?" My mother and father almost yelled in an astonished unison. I looked at them in disbelief at the total shock in their faces. "After she died, she turned into one of those things," I said. My father shook his head and hit his own leg with his hand. My mom covered her mouth with her hands and just sat quietly. My dad got up and moved over to the phone and picked it up, dialing furiously at the buttons. He held for a moment and then said, "I need to speak with John. It's important." I could hear someone on the other end, but could not make out what was being said. Dad then continued, "Okay, that sounds good. We'll talk soon." He turned to my mom. "They'll be here tomorrow." "What the hell is going on?" I asked, confused. My dad walked to the door, opened it, and left. The sound of the slam caused me to jump, as if suddenly reminding me of the booms I heard while underwater. The events of the last few minutes completely escaped my mind. "Mom, how did I escape? I was sure I was going to die," I said, shaking as a sob escaped my mouth. "Honey, there are things you need to know about our families, both your father's and mine." She looked at me with a sad, worried look. "And you need to learn them fast because I am sure the cops will be here soon." "But can't we just tell them the truth?" I began. "No, absolutely not," she said in the harshest tone I had ever heard her speak. "Son, this is not a joke, nor is it going to be easy to hear. We tried to keep you away from this, but it appears that will not be the case." "Mom," I said, becoming a bit unnerved. "Shush, I need you to listen now," she quietly demanded. "To start, the booms were sticks of dynamite that were being set off by your father. That is likely why those beasts left you alone." She let a small frown cross her face. "But for a very, very long time, during storms of this nature, these mermaids rise from the depths of the sea for one purpose: to kill humans. Us." She shook her head. "We don't think it's an attempt to take over the surface, more of a sport, a rite of passage maybe. We are not sure how long this has been happening. They have wiped out entire towns and villages over the years, but the truth is never told." She sighed heavily. "At some point, one of your dad's family, several generations back, was in an area when this happened. He had been a military man, so he stood his ground with a sword in hand and managed to survive the storm. For 3 days, he fought them back." Just then, my dad entered the room and sat down, and my mom continued. He had planned on keeping a body so that he could show it to the authorities, but each time he would cut one down, the body would be stolen from under him. Eventually, he had killed enough of them that they decided to leave him alone. My mom looked at my father, and then he continued the story. He tried to tell the authorities what had happened, but of course no one would believe him. Quite the opposite, in fact. They had blamed him for the murder of hundreds of people in the span of 3 days during a storm. They tossed him into jail and sentenced him to death. He took a slow breath and then sighed heavily. He managed to escape, saving his life, and in doing so, sent his entire bloodline down a path of never-ending battles with these beasts. He looked at my mom. Your mom's side of the family came in years later, when he had met another man who had attempted to tell the authorities the same story, but again, none would listen. However, he was lucky to not be blamed for the murders. He then made friends with this other man, and eventually they became close. And one night during a drunken rant, they had made plans to fight these devils, as they called them. Of course, neither of them really knew just how big it would become. And as they married and had kids, the stories were handed down. I could see his face turning red, but not only were the stories handed down, so was the fight. Over time, they developed ways to combat these mermaids, but they could only do so much. It was a different time, so travel and weapons were a different age. My mom was about to continue as she studied my face, and then there was a knock at the door. The door popped open and two people entered, one man, one woman. They looked at my parents. I am Detective Snyder, and this is Detective Rula. We would like a few minutes alone with your son. My parents looked at each other and then at me. My mind was racing from the story my parents had just told me, and I had no idea what to say to the detectives. My mom rested her hand on my leg and squeezed it gently, and her eyes were begging me to do the right thing. Tears began streaming from the corners of my eyes once again. The outrageous story they had told me was almost too much to accept, but I could tell they were telling what they knew to be the truth, and I know I had seen those bastards with my own eyes. At that moment, I had made up my mind to trust my parents, even though it meant lying to the detectives. "Son," Detective Rula said, "can you tell us what happened out there?" I closed my eyes tight for a moment and wiped the tears away. My wife, she's gone. It was dark, so I couldn't see much, the tears streaming more freely again. But I think it was a shark. I appreciate each one of you that was able to make it tonight. I cannot thank you enough. I hope you all enjoyed the story. You are all amazing. But until next time, remember, just because you couldn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't watching you.